Welcome to Let's Talk with Hart Hagen and Jake Bush. Jake, how are you doing today?
I am doing, I guess, as well as I could today. I got
Mhm.
a cinnamon twist this morning from a local bakery, so that's buoying my spirits. Uh, but otherwise, things are pretty calm, pretty chill in my residence, certainly not outside the window. How about you?
Right, yeah. Well, cinnamon is great. I had cinnamon cereal this morning, and cinnamon is great.
Put it on
So,
everything. That's my position for the day. Put it
right.
on everything.
So let's talk a little bit about what's been going on this week. Obviously, the big news is that the shooters who killed Breonna Taylor were not charged with a serious crime. Only one was charged with a crime, not charged with a serious crime. So, what do we make of this?
Certainly a whole lot to talk about here, especially related to some of the stuff we've been talking about. But, for those who are listening who maybe don't know, and I can't imagine you don't know, but Brett Hankison, one of the officers who was on the scene when Breonna Taylor was killed, was charged with a Class D felony for first degree wanton endangerment, multiple counts, I think, of that. But it's been sort of misreported in the media by saying he was arrested in the Breonna Taylor case. That is not entirely accurate. What he was arrested for was firing indiscriminately through the walls and windows and into neighboring apartments. It had nothing to do actually with the death of Breonna Taylor. So obviously, a great deal of anger, I think justified anger personally in the city over this latest development. And my gosh, the fallout has led to quite a bit of noteworthy things to talk about.
Right. So one thing that kind of confused me a little bit, let's say, for lack of a better description, the right-wing media has tried to smear Breonna Taylor as a person, drug dealer, that kind of thing. There's also the issue of her boyfriend shot first, something like that. So are the courts and the powers that be just trying to completely exonerate these officers in the face of wrongdoing? Is this a systemic thing, or is it personal fault that they should be held accountable for? What's your take on that?
I think that's a really good question because I think that gets missed a lot. That a lot of the times people, and again, I think justifiably, direct their anger at the police officers who are on the scene,
Mhm.
at Daniel Cameron, our attorney general, who passed down that ruling to not charge anybody for the death of Breonna Taylor. Again, totally justified to put some blame on them. But I think what can get missed and has the potential to be missed is that this is actually a systemic issue because, and I'm not a lawyer, so hey, I'm not an expert here, but it seems to me that there is a plausible situation where Daniel Cameron was actually going based off of the law as it is written. He made a big show about saying, I didn't want to rule based off of emotion. I wanted to go by the law as it is written. And I think that what he is trying to do is take himself off the hook, which I don't think he should be taken off the hook. But I think that what we really need to start opening up the conversation is, well, why on earth are the laws as written in such a way that could lead to this very obvious case where justice is completely not being served? You know what I mean?
Right, exactly. So there's this thing about immunity. The police officers have a certain type of like
Qualified
conditional
and
qualified
qualified.
immunity. Yeah.
Yeah, where they are not personally held liable for things that you when you sue the police or there's wrongdoing by the police, the individual police officer is not going to be held liable. It will be the police department as a whole, and the taxpayer is really in the end liable rather than the police themselves. uh, which
Oh,
I would imagine people would be more upset about, frankly, that their tax dollars are getting these cops off the hook for their
mhm.
mistakes. But hey,
Right,
whatever.
right. So there's also a thing happened this week. Shameka Parrish Wright and Attica Scott, State Representative Attica Scott and Shameka Parrish Wright, who has been she's a local activist who also ran for school board. They were both arrested. One of them Attica Scott for a Class D felony. What happened there?
So I want to clarify. So Shameka, what you said is true. Local activist did run for school board, but she has also been maybe the most. I don't want to take anything away from anybody else by saying the most, but if not the most, then one of the most active organizers. Not just an activist who's out there all the time, but somebody who's actually calling coalitions together, calling groups out to Injustice Square Park, where the demonstrations have been, and trying to build a real, viable organization. Right. And she was arrested as well. And I believe it may have been a Class D felony for her as well. And so what happened was, and by the way, we're joined right now, Danita. Hello.
Hi,
Nice.
Danita. We've just been joined by Danita Wright. Danita, glad you could join us. We're
Hi.
talking about, Jake was talking about the arrest of Attica Scott and Shameka Parrish Wright. And you're talking about Shameka has been a prominent leader in organizing the protests, et cetera.
Yeah, yeah. And the other night, I believe it was 2 nights ago, Attica and Shameka were with a group that were marching down 4th Street near the library, the main library, and the Unitarian Church down there on York Street and 4th. And there was a big kerfuffle where there was a window at the library that had been broken out, and somebody threw a road flare inside. No long-lasting damage, thank goodness. But all reports from the scene would indicate that that was like a lone actor kind of situation, that somebody broke from the group, did that. Nobody really knows who it was. Nobody really talked to that person. They just kind of went off and did that without any warning or any signs. Attica herself was live streaming on the way to the Unitarian Church, which is right across the street from the library. It had been decided beforehand that if protesters needed a place to go to be safe from prosecution after curfew, they could come to that church and be, protected by private property rules that allow the church immunity from the curfew.
How
She was
awesome is that? How awesome is that?
right, yeah,
For a church to
fantastic.
do that.
Yeah,
All the churches should do that.
I
Every last one
agree.
of them.
I agree. And they actually had offered for people if they need, rides, that sort of thing, food. They were offering all these
They
things.
fed them.
They did. Yeah, they
Mhm.
had set up food. And on the way there at around 8:58, because Attica was live streaming this entire time, she and her entire group, including her daughter and Shameka Parrish Wright, were arrested, allegedly in connection with the breaking of the library window. That's what the police are saying.
It was one person. One person did that.
Right, exactly. One person.
And what the powers that be want to do in situations like that is to take a leader and charge them with conspiracy. Like, a leader is a ringleader, or a leader is inciting people to violence. The
We
leader put
call
them
it
up to
we call
this.
we call it cut off the head of the snake.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. And so what we ended up with was what I think a pretty, frankly, kind of disgusting display where the police department was trying to insinuate that Attica Scott was destroying the library in her own district, by the way. That is the district that she represents, a library that she has gone on record countless times to fight tooth and nail in the legislature to support that library. And they were trying to insinuate that she and her daughter and Shameka Parrish Wright, who again has been in full support of libraries for God knows how long, that to insinuate that they had anything to do with the vandalism there.
It's libel. It's libel.
I mean, yeah, I think we're crossing into this territory where that's just malicious slander. Personally, that's the way I see it. But yeah, it is worth noting that she is charged with a Class D felony, which is the same category that Brett Hankison, that officer who was arrested, was also charged with a Class D felony. Now, he spent 32 minutes in jail. She spent the whole night in jail. So read into that how you want.
What folks don't understand is that no matter how large the protesting group gets, they have so many so-called managers, protesting managers. That thing is so organized. I've watched them. Someone was filming as they were walking with them, and a lady fell ill, and they lit up a red flare. Was it at night? They lit up a red flare to show everybody that there's somebody in trouble over here. I said, look at the organization of these people.
Mm-hmm.
There was they came up against the LMPD, and there were two organizers that the LMPD had jerked out of their line, like they were getting ready to. They grabbed hold of three people, but then the two organizers from the group went over there and they spoke to them in a calm and said, well, what do you want to? You've told us that we are okay to do this, but now you're saying it's not okay. What is it that is okay? Just tell us what is okay. And he said to turn around and go back the other way. And that's what they did. They turned around and went back the other way. Just tell us what you want us to do. But they tell them one thing and then they flip it and say, now it's wrong.
Yeah. Jake, you were talking a couple months ago about how how disciplined the protesters were. And I think that's what Danita's talking about now.
They have so many managers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I call them managers.
Right.
Right. And I think that this gets to, an important point that I had made, because, I think we've all had these conversations mainly from people out of town and about people saying like, oh, it's just a riot up there, it's chaos and all this stuff. And it always blows my mind because I think, well, one, you're not there, I am. So don't tell me how it is when I'm seeing it with my own two eyes. But, the other thing is that I try to stress to people is that, yeah, when people have these sort of, as you called them, Danita, these sort of protest managers, right? Sort of like some discipline in organization, some leadership, right? Some leadership. Right. People are pretty disciplined when the leaders are around, but I have personally witnessed cases where police make an effort to separate the mass of people who are protesting from these very active leaders, because I do believe that they know that once you, as you said, Danita, cut off the head of the snake and separate people from the leadership, that's when discipline can break down.
They become wandering sheep, just, and ripe for the taking.
Right. And in that analogy, I guess the police would be the wolves.
Yeah. Yes.
So yeah, Hart,
right.
Hart, I think you would be able to bring us back a little bit for some historical perspective, because we've been talking about Martin Luther King Jr., the civil rights movement, the efforts to neutralize him. Do you mind just briefly sort of filling us in on that so we can continue this conversation?
So if you're just joining us, we are talking about the FBI versus Dr. King, the FBI's war against Dr. King. This is based on very good evidence, based on an investigation by the Church Committee in the mid-1970s. They did an extensive report of how Dr. King had been the subject of FBI investigation pursuant to programs such as ComInfil, Communist Infiltration, COINTELPRO, Counterintelligence Program, a program called Race Matters, and as part of the Domestic Intelligence Division, which the FBI is authorized to solve crimes and to investigate for crimes, but they're also authorized to investigate people that might be agents of a foreign enemy. So this is the Cold War. This is Russia and China are the big bad communist enemies. And Dr. King allegedly was associated with people associated with the Communist Party USA, which there was some truth to, but don't get me started about whether that should be a subject of an investigation or whether we should even be involved in a Cold War. But quoting from the report, it says, from December 1963 until his death in 1968, Martin Luther King was the target of an intensive campaign by the Federal Bureau of an Investigation to neutralize him as an effective civil rights leader. In the words of the man in charge of the FBI's, quote, war against Dr. King, no holds were barred. We have used similar techniques against Soviet agents. The same methods were brought home against any organization against which we were targeted. We did not differentiate. This is a tough, tough business. And it says the FBI has acknowledged 16 occasions on which microphones were hidden in Dr. King's hotel and motel rooms in an attempt to obtain information about the private activities of King and his advisors for use to completely discredit them. We could go on and on about one of the most dramatic things about this story is that the things that were said internally and to reporters about Dr. King, like, what's his name? Head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, was the head of the FBI throughout all this. And he says, in 1970, Director Hoover told reporters that Dr. King was, quote, the last one in the world who should ever have received the Nobel Peace Prize. Shortly afterward, Time magazine chose Dr. King as the Man of the Year, an honor which elicited Director Hoover's comment that they had to dig deep in the garbage to come up with this one. And there's another revealing quote that says, but as a result of Dr. King's I have a dream speech, the FBI's Domestic Intelligence Division described this demagogic speech as yet more evidence that Dr. King was the most dangerous and effective Negro leader in the country. And it's the most dangerous and effective. Like, if he hadn't been so damn effective, he wouldn't have been so dangerous. But he's dangerous because he's effective. If he succeeds, that is a threat to the powers that be in our country.
Imagine that. If he had succeeded in doing what?
Right.
Giving equality. I mean, think about that. What was he trying to do? Was he trying to damage America? Was he trying to destroy America? No, he was trying to bring America together. He was trying to unite America in equality for all. And in some form or fashion, the powers that be don't want that. And wonder why they don't.
You tell me. Talk to me about that.
Well, the manipulation of a population. You cannot manipulate them if they have the same power as you do. You know, if they are on your level, if they're face to face instead of beneath you, you cannot manipulate them. If we're all shepherds and there's no sheep, who are you going to lead? Who are you going to manipulate?
Yeah, and I think that it shows how, like you mentioned, Danita, like we Mahat and I have sort of talked about this before, like to us, the mission of a Dr. King, I think that we can make the segue to Attica and Shameka as leaders here in Louisville. What they're doing is perfectly rational and really shouldn't be that controversial at all, but it is because their mission is a threat to people who want to hoard power. You know what I mean? These people who want to hoard power and keep us divided along racial lines or cultural lines. Exactly. They see this unifying message as a major threat. And I think that, again, if I could segue a little bit to our current situation here in Louisville, I think that whether it's intentional or not, them arresting and putting these sort of trumped up charges on Attica and Shameka in particular, whether they're intentionally trying to do this or not, what they're really doing is trying to threaten the movement by making it personal against these leaders.
Exactly. I mean, if you really got to think about this, there is something sick going on with our leaders in America, in the government. There's something sick going on in our capitalistic system. Something really sick. Because if you imagine unifying Americans, if we were unified, we'd have the best doctors, the best scientists. Imagine.
And how many doctors and scientists would love to work? How many doctors would love to focus on treating people? And how many scientists would love to practice science instead of just being a sellout to big corporations?
Imagine being a powerful country, not just by money, but by knowledge, by ingenious inventions. When's the last time we had one? I mean, come on now. That was an age, a time where we were sprouting everything. We were making and inventing everything, but they stunted. They've stunted our growth, and we could be that powerful nation. We could really be a powerful nation that everybody looks up to. But now they just look at us like, what's wrong with them people?
Well, we're number one, number one in COVID. What else are we number one? Number one in like
prison population
among industrial.
Y'all keep talking. I'll be right back.
Okay. Highest healthcare costs in the world. We're number one. We do it right. Whatever we do it right. Highest healthcare costs in the world.
Yeah. Well,
we spend more money on weapons than we export more weapons than any country in the world by a factor of, like, take the next 7 to 10 countries in the world in terms of defense spending, in terms of export of arms. We're arming both sides in the war in Syria. We're arming Al-Qaeda and what's the other one? ISIL.
Yeah,
we're supplying arms to these people. We're number one in supplying both sides of a conflict. We supplied both sides of the Iran-Iraq war. We're the number one oppressor of the people of Latin America. We're the number one supplier of oppressive police states in Latin America, not least of all Guatemala, Colombia, Brazil, Honduras. We are number one.
Right, and I think that we certainly have made the case that we need a better path. And I think that, the way to get there is really the question of the day. And I think that, something I wanted to bring up was how this sort of this development where leaders are being targeted, how does that relate to the organizational structure in this protest movement? Because we're trying to get that path to this world that you and Danita have been talking about, and how we get there is a big question. I think you were going to say something. Go ahead.
Well, ideally, I mean, yes, Martin Luther King, remarkable person, but shouldn't, ideally somebody else could take his place, but he was a person of exceptional talent. So that other person to take their place after they got done with him, they assassinated Fred Hampton. We know this. We know this 100% certain, beyond a reasonable doubt. The courts didn't find beyond a reasonable doubt, but any person examining that evidence, knowing how corrupt the criminal courts were, the prosecutor was, the cops were, knows that beyond any shadow of doubt, Fred Hampton, the year after Dr. King was assassinated, Fred Hampton was straight up murdered in his own bed. So one leader, plus the FBI was probably involved in the assassination of Malcolm X, probably. And you don't have to be the one that pulls the trigger. You just be the instigator of these rivalries, So cutting off the head of that snake.
There were a lot of leaders. It was Malcolm and John F. Kennedy, and Robert Kennedy, then Martin Luther King, and then...
And that's just in the United States.
I mean...
Lumumba in Congo at the same time. Patrice Lumumba.
Yeah.
I mean, just hit after hit after hit.
And I think that brings us to a really important question, and one that I don't see being sort of a major topic of conversation all the time. And of course, we're all in a major moment of instability right now. So it's very hard to just sit down and be like, okay, I know that like we're all out in the streets, but we need to have a meeting to sort this out. It's not really how it works. But, I think it's worth asking these questions when we have a moment to breathe. How do we want to structure this movement? Because as it's been operating, it's been this very decentralized movement without very many prominent leaders on their own. And part of that, I think, is because of what you all are explaining, that historically speaking, when that happens, it's very easy for the resisting government or whomever to just take out that leader and kneecap the whole movement, right? But the question that I have is whether or not a little more central leadership might be beneficial, in order to exert a little more discipline within the people involved in the movement, and in order to set
I'm
these clear
entirely
goals.
unorganized, and you're asking me to be organized. I can't process that.
Well, I know that personally I am a deeply unorganized person as well, so maybe I'm not the best person to ask.
I've never been on the battlefield, but I've watched movies. And you've got your soldiers out on the front line. They're fighting, but in the background, you've got strategic plans being created,
Mhm.
and by officers are
Mhm.
creating these strategic plans. So um, I see what you're saying, Jake, is that while the protesters are out on the front lines, and we need that, we do need that,
Absolutely.
but we also need some kind of central internal control kind of planning committees going on too, little, you know, uh, circles of people, groups, doing the behind the scenes planning. Because yes, Martin Luther King led a civil rights march movement, and all we saw was the march, but we didn't see the behind the scenes planning that he was doing with LBJ. We didn't see that, but obviously there were conversations going. LBJ didn't just wake up one day and say, well, I'm gonna sign this
Right.
into
Right.
something. Some kind of conversation was going on in the background, that the people marching and being sprayed with hoses or what, they wasn't in on that part, but they were the fighter. They were out on the front lines, but behind the scenes is where the real change was coming from. That's where the new acts and the civil rights acts, the new voting rights acts, and all of that was coming from these talks behind the scenes. So someone once told me, it's not what you see, it's what you don't see.
Yeah. Yeah.
How many years before, I don't know, how many years, when did Martin Luther King start reading about Gandhi?
Right.
Years and years and years before it came to fruition.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that, as you were saying, Danita, it's a lot of things that go behind the scenes. And I think that what you can kind of get out of that is getting rid of these sort of conflicting narratives that come out in the protest movement. You have some people marching, and they have this competing narrative with other protesters, and then they have a little spat in the middle of a protest. I've seen that happen. Or you see people who sort of break off as this sort of lone wolf that do things like vandalize the library, and we don't know if that was just an outside agitator, or if that was Attica Scott herself has alleged that could have been a police officer. We have no idea,
Yeah.
But the fact that, we don't know is, I think, an argument in favor of having, when I say central leadership, let me just go ahead and jump out ahead of this. I don't think Attica Scott or Shameka Parrish Wright should be like Joseph Stalin or something. That's not what I'm suggesting. But sort of an internal democracy in place, an essential sort of organization that can sort of be an umbrella group, so that we're all on the same page. We all know what the message is. We all know what we're here for and how to do it, so that you don't have these sort of conflicting actions and conflicting narratives. You know what I mean?
Well, let's say that you have, let's say that there's a pattern for a small organization in how to organize, lead, and deliberate, that kind of thing. What would you like to see happen as a result, either with a certain organization or with a movement generally? What are we trying to get to?
Power to the people.
Yeah, and
power to the people.
And the way that you do that, because Danita, you're saying, sorry, I read Shameka while I'm talking to Danita, and I almost called you Shameka. I'm sorry. I need to look away from my notes when I'm talking. But
these 3-syllable names, they all blend together.
Right. Yeah. And what I would like to see, that power to the people, what I want to see by that is not just a slogan, but by saying, as an organization, as an institution, we want to model the democracy that we're trying to create in the world. That's what I'd like to see, like an internal democratic structure where you do have roles that are clearly defined, so that people are accountable, because they can't say, well, I'm not a leader. I was just here with a megaphone. It's like, well, no, we voted you as the leader, so you're accountable. You know what I mean? But having that sort of structure in place, because Kwame Ture said it best. He said, mobilization is tenuous. Mobilization can go away. People can be in the streets and then just sort of go back home and nothing will change. He said, but organization lasts forever.
Yeah.
Now, the ultimate goal is to take that sort of, model of government that you're talking about and place it where it should go, in the White House, on Capitol Hill, in Congress.
Yeah.
Place it where it should be.
Yeah.
What's keeping it from being that way right now, Danita?
Well, the people that make the laws are the people we're fighting against. The system from which we're fighting against, they have all the mechanisms that can change things. They change the laws, and if they do wrong, they can even change the laws to make their wrongs right. So as long as they have all of that.
You mean they can vote for socialized medicine for themselves, but not for us?
Who'd have thunk it?
But Jake had a good thing, though. We could still do a model of our own. And out of that model, people will see that when people see something working, when they see it working, they gravitate toward it. They literally gravitate toward it. So if they see that it's working, they will put that person and replace that other person. We just slowly replace people up in Capitol Hill, up in the White House. Just start slowly replacing them, and then everything is where it should be.
What are some steps in that direction? What could we be doing?
Building a model.
And I think that it's important to note here that these two people that we really picked out to talk about, in Shameka, Parrish, Wright, and Attica Scott, have been models for what we're talking about, right? I know that organizations that I'm a part of have been contacted by Shameka, Parrish, Wright to be a presence in the protest and to come and open a table and speak to people and try to turn people out. And what she's showing there is this model of coalition building around a unified sort of struggle, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that that's a great model for how to go about not just protest movements, but generally in politics, as this idea of bringing in these seemingly disparate groups and disparate people and saying, hey, you have a stake in this too. Hey, join us on this and we'll join you in that. That's sort of been what Shameka's been doing for this movement. And I think that it's telling that she was singled out here. And I think that it's telling that Attica Scott, as a representative in our government, has been had these charges attached to her when she's been leading the charge on further police accountability. And she's been leading the charge. We're talking about libraries because the library library window was broken. She's been fighting for better funding for things like libraries and social services to help people. Mm-hmm. And I think that it shows that kind of thing is a threat to the powers that be, that people who engage in this sort of action and put forward this model, as we're talking about, are seen as a threat because it's powerful. It really is.
Jake, what I hear you saying is that here are two leaders that exemplify like trying to do what the people want them to do. And you're telling me that Attica Scott walks her neighborhood nearly every day and just contact with people and very approachable. And it's like, what do you want? What do you need? How can we help? How can we work together? Which is arguably, that's organizing, which is a bottom-up thing, as opposed to mobilizing, which is a top-down thing.
Yeah, I didn't think about it that way, the bottom-up versus top-down, but you're right. It's different when you have leaders, and this is what I think we have right now, which is sort of a mild critique of the organization of the movement, which again is nobody in particular's fault. We're all just sort of scrambling to do something right now.
We've never seen democracy. It's not as if our educational system or our workplace is designed to get us to practice democracy
We're building it from scratch.
It's complete lack of experience in democracy, for one
thing. There you
thing.
go.
Exactly. And I think what we have right now, and again, this is a very mild critique. I don't want this to sound like I'm against the Black Lives Matter movement. That, please do not think that that's where I am with
I
this.
heard that about you.
Well, you can disregard anyone who says that. But what I'm saying is, I think what we can move toward is that organizing rather than the mobilizing. Because what we have now is the leaders who do pop up spontaneously, you know, people who grab a megaphone, you know, or something like that. They can mobilize people and say, hey, you go this way, you go that way. But the problem is when that leader leaves or is removed by the police, people have nowhere to go because they have not engaged in the process of being disciplined, of getting on message or anything. Whereas these leaders that I'm talking about, like Attica and Shameka, try to build from the bottom people's capacity. Do you see what I'm saying? And instill these guiding principles in people that make them more disciplined and more prone to organizing. Does that make sense?
It's like if you were a football team, would you just show up on the field without having done any practice, run any plays, no coaching, et cetera, like that? So, you know, the organizing is all that preparation that goes on in advance.
But again, people like to see results. And when they start seeing results, that's power. And people gravitate toward power. Whoever has the power, that's where they gravitate toward. And so with all of their leadership, when they can turn a militaristic police force into a community-oriented police force, when they can get a city and state and federal government, not federal, because that's where we're aiming for federal. When they can get the city and state governments to come in on their model, then they got power. They will be gaining power. And
when you say power, one thing that comes to mind is freedom is participation in power. So we have freedom to the extent that we have power, and if we build power, we'll have freedom. Just because we're told we have freedom from cradle to grave doesn't mean we actually have freedom. It's amazing how many ways we don't have freedom because we don't have power, where there's this democratic deficit. We don't get to choose. You know, democratic deficit is what we have versus what we want. Here's what we want. Do we have that? You know, war. Do we get what we want? Do we want, you know, most people think that war should be a last resort. Most people think that health care should be provided, but we have this for-profit system. And in so many ways, there's a difference between what we have and what we want. So that's not freedom. It's not participation in power. So what I hear Danita talking about is organizing for power.
It's like it's the kind of power I'm speaking of too is equity. It's power and equality. No one person should have power because power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So you spread it out. Just like
Jeff Bezos has too much power?
Mitch.
Yeah, Mitch
is the most powerful man in this whole nation.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole nation, no one person should have that much power. No one person or two or three. It should spread out so that everyone feels empowered. It should be equally divided.
So you're saying one ideal we're working for is for power to be distributed more and for people to feel like they're participating in that power.
And again, the people that lead us to that, they automatically have power from the people. The power won't come from them. The power will come from the people. That's where their powers will come from. And it's not from them towards us, but from us towards them. It's a reverse. So I hope you understand what I'm saying here.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Two different types of power, the way you can look at power.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something that is interesting here, and maybe I'm jumping ahead of the conversation, but you know, what I would want to say to somebody getting involved in this movement, right? And really wants to be an active, organized part of this movement. You know, what I would want to communicate is that you would need this cycle to organize, right? Because I think, Danita, you hit on something really powerful here for me, which is that, you know, victories begat the ability to organize further because more people will buy in. And that's an important part of organizing. You have to get people to buy in. So you have to win to further organize so that you can win, so that you can forward, or you see what I'm saying? It works in this sort of cycle. And it's a chicken or the egg thing. And I think a lot of people have it in their heads that we need to organize first and then win. Problem is, we're already in the fight. You know, you can't call timeout right now and say, all right, we got to get our game plan together. It's like, no, there's no timeouts, you know. It's not like boxing where you get a minute between the rounds to talk it over with your coach. It's not how this works.
I wish you guys had
just joining us.
You know Ann Braden, right? You knew Ann Braden. That woman was up 24/7, 24/7. She was up making calls 2, 3 in the morning. You know, when you're in a fight like this for social change and equality for all, it is a 24/7. Because you best believe the people and the systems, the capitalistic system that we have right now, the leaders within that capitalistic system, they don't sleep.
Right.
They don't sleep. You know, we are so traumatized. We need to sleep. We need to rest because of the trauma that they're pressing on us, the oppression that they're pressing on us. We have to rest.
Shock doctrine.
Yeah.
You know, but we need that rest so we can get our minds rejuvenated again, you know, to come out with a better plan, with a better model, and continue the fight.
If you're just joining us, this is Hart Hagen with Let's Talk, and I'm joined by Jake Bush and Danita Wright, and we are talking about the FBI versus Martin Luther King, the whole scandal where they tracked him as part of their effort to neutralize him, and this is relevant today because just this week we had Attica Scott, Representative Attica Scott, and also Shameka Parrish Wright were arrested. We think that maybe they were arrested because they are effective African-American leaders and the cops want to make an example. We can't prove that, but there's just the slightest possibility that it could be true, that they're being made an example of. So anyway, it's part of the religion of what we call the religion of anti-communism, the religion of anti-socialism, what Noam Chomsky talks about in his propaganda model. There are 5 filters on what the media does and does not tell us, including who owns the media, who sponsors the media. There's this thing called FLAC. And then there's this religion of anti-socialism, which broadly defined socialism means you're trying to do something for people, actual people, not the powerful people at the very, very top, but actual people. So it's just this religion of we're going to go after anybody that wants to do anything for people.
And I would say real quick that, you know, you were saying that we can't prove that this was intentional, right? That they really were sitting out there like, all right, we got to find Shameka and Attica. There they are. All right, we'll go get them. I don't know that they did that. There's no way to possibly know that in either direction. But the point that I want to make is that the intention doesn't necessarily matter, because what ends up happening is the same thing as if it were intentional, right?
It's not as if there's a white supremacist element in law enforcement. I mean, it's not as if law enforcement attracts white supremacists or anything like that.
Well, you make a compelling...
Don't be ridiculous.
You do make a compelling case that maybe there is some of that intention there, no joke. But my point is that, you know, I don't want to get bogged down arguing with people whether or not it was intentional, because the point remains the same. That whether it was intended to happen this way or not, what they have done is put 2 effective leaders behind bars and tried to smear their names as being a part of a subversive, violent element, and trying to slander them publicly with these charges, which are obviously absurd on their face.
You're saying the establishment meets in rooms to talk about this stuff. No, they don't meet in rooms. They meet on carousels. It's like, hey, let's create a white supremacist law enforcement system.
Right.
It just happens.
Yeah, they don't even have to do that because the system sort of perpetuates itself. Like you were saying, there's this the religion of anti-communism is how Chomsky put it. It's baked into the system at this point. That it functions this way.
Okay, and that religion of anti-communism has morphed into terrorism. Communism used to be the big bad enemy. Now terrorism used to be the big bad enemy. We have this Patriot Act, and everybody's a terrorist. And what's her name? Michelle Alexander shows that the Patriot Act has not been used primarily in the war on terror. It has been used primarily in the war on drugs, and we know that the war on drugs has disproportionately impacted people of color. I'm just saying.
Which was the intention.
Yeah.
Watch out for that Patriot Act, though. Keep a close eye on that Patriot. The Patriot Act, you do know it wipes out the Constitution.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So you need to really watch out for that Patriot Act. And out of that Patriot Act came the Homeland Security. It's like a chess. If you ever played chess, you set up the board,
mm-hmm.
Or it's like a bucket or a pot full of frogs in water, and the waters, you slowly boil the water so they don't know until it's too late.
Right.
You know, these people, and I'm gonna call them these people. God help me.
I'm not going to use that phrase, but you can use the phrase.
Do you know that there's over 200 and something think tanks in America?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know that we don't have, none of them work for us.
Right.
For the working poor, the working poor. 200 and something think tanks. Imagine that. They've really got their game together. You know, they've taken everything that we built and turned it over to their side so that they can use it against us. And they watch us. They watch us to create something else so they can take that. And, but we need to be careful and be aware of that.
And I
definitely be aware of the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act should not be in existence whatsoever.
Yeah,
because the Constitution states that no other, it shouldn't have any other document that should be over the Constitution. No other document.
Yeah, eliminates
yet
the right
have
to
a
a fair
Patriot Act
trial.
that showed up in a matter of days.
Yeah, the Constitution versus the Patriot Act. So the Constitution guarantees a right to fair trial. Patriot Act eliminates that. Constitution guarantees a right that we won't have search and seizure without a warrant. Patriot Act eliminates that. We could go on.
And what I'm hearing from both of you, and I think Danita, to carry on your sort of example or your analogy of sort of setting the board, right, is that once you have set the board the way that you want it, it doesn't really matter how you want to play at that point because you've already positioned yourself to win the game, right? You've done it. Right. You've set the board, and that sort of, I think, shows the systemic nature of how this works. Again, it doesn't matter if the police were intentionally targeting these two women we've been talking about because the system has sort of set itself up to work this way. And I think that that's another warning sign, like you were saying, that be aware that our leaders, and maybe this is an argument against my point that in having stronger central leadership, maybe this is an argument that that isn't really viable because it's so much easier nowadays. In past episodes, Hart and I have talked about Martin Luther King Jr. and how the FBI were surveilling him. But think about how much more sophisticated they are now at surveilling people and smearing their names. They can do it now so much easier than they used to. So perhaps that is maybe insurmountable struggle to try to get stronger leadership in these movements.
But you also, where the glimmer of hope is, whoever these people are that invent this technology, they're people, they're humans. And one side might make them, become this evil entity, to follow their lead, their agenda. But there's something inside humans that seem to throw a wrench You know, if you've seen the most powerful, we can look back in history and see the most powerful nations being torn down because of humans, because they didn't want to take it anymore. And they, you know, because right is right. Right is still the number one weapon against, you know, wrong. We're humans. We still have this this humanity that's in us. It may be a little dim, but it's still there. Still there. And when these protesters came out, I was in tears. You know, I was literally in tears because all I could say was, look at humanity. Mm-hmm. Look at humanity. It's still there. People are willing to fight, still willing to fight. I saw them at the Unitarian.
Try as they might, they have not yet completely broken our spirit. Try as they might, they have not yet sucked the marrow out of the bones. Try as they might, they have not yet sucked the life out of us.
Say that. Say that.
Not yet.
Not yet. You know,
give them time.
Well, I keep thinking about, and Hart, I've said this to you a million times, but that new Tyler Childers. Yeah, well, that new Tyler Childers song, The Country Artist, and he put out the song Long Violent History, which is pro Black Lives Matter and everything. And again, a white country artist from Eastern Kentucky is come out in support. And at the end of it, you know, he was talking about, you know, what if they tried to haul off these boys off of our mountain, you know, the country boys and all that? What if they did that to us? And he said, you know, would that be the start of a long violent history of us tucking our tails and just trying to abide? You know? And I think that what y'all are saying, it gives me a little hope that no, not quite. We're not there yet of just tucking our tails.
Just a little tiny glimpse of something we're going to study at some point. But Gerald Horne has this book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, where he says, you know, the revolution was actually a counter-revolution. It was more like putting down, it was more like breaking from Britain because Britain was moving toward anti-slavery. But it reveals how irrepressible the spirits were of the African people who, you know, in all over the Caribbean and the South, there was a lot of resistance. And that's just kind of the prevailing theme from that book, how much resistance there was that really I didn't hear very much about this in my history classes. I heard about how anyway, so just the irrepressible spirit of people who often couldn't even speak each other's languages, couldn't speak English, but just constant, they were a pain to the people that wanted to bring them here and make a profit. You know, you want to have as many slaves as you possibly can, except that when you're outnumbered 10-1, you got problems. Yeah. So, you know, anyway.
Yeah. And I think that brings us to kind of the last point that we wanted to talk about.
Poison their meals, poison their food. You know, that's how we deal with these matters.
Right. Well, that's what they try. And I think that shared experience that a lot of people are experiencing in this country, and it's all a matter of degree, because I know that, like, in the kind of place that I grew up in, the country is mostly white people. You know, they obviously are not experiencing half of the violence that you know, Black communities in Louisville are experiencing at the hands of police. But I think it's important to communicate with the people, like where I grew up, they're saying, like, look, these issues where they're pushing drugs on you, they're arresting you in mass numbers, they're, you know, they can do anything they want to you, they're sucking the life out of these rural communities. It's the same people doing it for the same reasons as why they do what they did to Breonna Taylor. Exactly. And I think that what we're seeing with the Black Lives Matter movement, and there are probably some sort of like vulgar leftists who don't really, for whatever reason, discount the Black Lives Matter movement. And though they do exist, there's not that many of them, I don't think, thank God. But, you know, I think the lesson that they need to learn is that...
It would be the first time white people were clueless.
Yeah, I mean, really. But, you know, I think that what they need to learn is that we could build a real viable model for a broad class struggle out of this movement. And I think
that's why Martin Luther King was a threat. That's why Fred Hampton was a threat, because they were effective at building bridges across ethnicity.
Yeah, as again, Shameka and Attica have been, you know, like, I know that a lot of the groups I'm in, not for any like intentional reason, but we always end up being mostly white people. And some people say, we don't want you here. We don't want more white people here, you know, which is, you know, fine. That's how you want to do it. That's fine. You know, but I know that Shameka has intentionally reached out and been like, I know you guys, there's a lot of you are white, but like, I want you here partially because of that reason, to build a coalition between, you know, your communities and my community. And I know that Attica has been very vocal about, you know, these mostly white rural areas being subjected to violence and repression. And I think that they're building this sort of coalition model is a real viable model for us.
And see, what I tell Black groups, or any Black group meeting that I'm in, I'm like, it's like Martin Luther King said, you know, you go by the person's character, not the color of their skin. You know, are they fighting for, what are they fighting for? Look at what they're fighting for, not the color of their skin, because, you know, Cameron, need I say more? Okay, so you got these people that only look at the color of people's skin and say, you know, that's what we want. No, you want who, you got to look at what they're fighting for. Look at their character. Look at what they do. You know, don't look at the color of their skin. That's, you know, if Harriet Tubman had waited for slaves to build an underground railroad, you know, there would be no underground railroad. You know, you got to look at what the people do. You got to look at what they are fighting for also.
The character, you know,
are they with struggle. You or are they against
you? Yeah, that's what you look at. That's good.
Because I'm beginning to think that some white people are beginning to see that, hey, this may not stop at Black people. This may spill over into, you know, maybe this is a rich against the poor, you know, and we're poor. And so this might be that they're trying to you know, throw us off by saying that they're just attacking Blacks, but this may spill over into us. I believe they're beginning to open their eyes to see this is not going to stop. Greed grows. It grows. It does not stop. It grows. And if once they get it, you know, once they, in their mind, if they get the Blacks under control or whatever, that they're not going to stop there. They're not going to stop there. They're going to switch, and they're coming after you. They're coming after you too.
Gosh, that's very powerful. You know, I know that we're running low on time. I'll read this quote if that's quite all right.
Yeah.
I just shared it in the chat. It's from a song, and a white rapper actually said, "Funny thing about a cage, they're never built for just one group. So when that cage is done with them and you're still poor, it'll come for you. The newest lowest on the totem. Well, golly gee, you've been used. You help to fuel the death machine that down the line will kill you too." And I think that
exactly.
that pretty well, I hope, reflects what you were saying, Danita, that like
exactly.
This is a broad coalition that we need to build, because if you're selling out to the death machine and backing them, it's going to turn around on you next.
We have less than a minute left. Anybody want to wrap it up? What's the big picture here? What's the big issue here?
Don't mourn, organize. I think Joe Hill said it better than I could about 100 years ago. The best thing to do now is to get involved. And sometimes the best way to get involved is to be in the streets, but try to organize, man. Try to impose mutual obligation to one another. That's what it's all about.
And there has been a lot of good organizing going on. Danita?
And not only organize, but let's get some models. Let's start building these models.
Yep.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Danita Wright and Jake Bush, for joining me. This has been Let's Talk with Hart Hagen, and we're going to come back next week. And I hope you all have a real good day. Join us again soon. How's that?
Thanks.
Bye.